This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're going to be taking a look at Compensation Issues 2014, and with us is our guest who is the best person we could ask to talk about this, and that is David Chun, who's the CEO of Equilar, Inc., or as I like to, which makes him cringe, refer to him as the king of compensation research. So, David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, TK. Pleasure to be back on the air.
Well, let's start by you sort of recapping the season as you've seen it so far. And the two most popular things as far as this show goes are CEO compensation, and then we can't leave out director compensation. So why don't you give us a lay of the land, what you're sort of seeing so far?
Sure. So we, as you saw recently, the New York Times study ran, which we've been doing for the past 7, 8, maybe 9 years now. And as you could imagine, pay was up about 9%. In light of, I think it's always when you're talking about pay, you have to talk about performance. I mean, you can't take one out of context. And if you think about, large caps, corporate performance over the past year, I mean, you had the stock market up over 30%. And on top of that, profits were up about 16%. Top line growth, revenues were only up about 3 to 4%. But the bottom line is I think shareholders were very happy with the performance of companies over the past year, and rightfully so. Executives, specifically CEOs, saw an increase in pay. You didn't see pay go up 20, 30% along with shareholder return, but you'd expect with the robust equity markets, especially, given even the prior year, I think the total shareholder return was up another about 13, 14%. So you had, a nice recovery from the 08-09 recession, and as a result, you're seeing pay up. The pay trends, when you start to kind of peel the onion and look at the various components, bonuses were up, cash bonuses were up, about 10%. Stock awards, the mix in equity, you're seeing the continued shift towards stock awards and away from stock options. And, you're seeing more companies granting performance-based shares. And given that the performance metrics are typically around EPS and total shareholder return, with both being up strongly in the past year, you're seeing pay rising accordingly with that. The other interesting thing we're seeing around pay is it's greater convergence around the median. And what I mean by that is you're seeing less of the outliers. You're seeing less of the eye-popping numbers. There's still going to be, the media still finds them and they still write about them, but you're not seeing as many of them, as many packages. I think there was only one pay package north of 50 million in the past year, which is a good thing in the sense that you're seeing boards doing their responsibility around that. Director pay, you're not seeing a whole lot of changes there. You're seeing the similar, continue, mid-single digit increase in pay. Frankly, given the amount of scrutiny, responsibility, and effort that boards are asked to provide as part of their stewardship of corporations, frankly, I think board members are frankly woefully still underpaid relative to the exposure that they have as individuals. But that being said, no major eye-popping changes in that.
Yeah. That's your comment on director pay. That's a great segue. The ISS with their Quick Score 2.0 has a factor in there about director pay and looking at it. And, it surprises me. I think if you talk to most institutional investors or whatever, it is a nit.
Yes.
I mean, it is a rounding error, okay?
It's a gnat on the back of an elephant.
Right. And with all the responsibility, any clue on why that has?
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, that's probably a question you should be asking Pat McGurn and his team there, why they care about it. I think the reason, from an outsider's perspective, I think why the ISS is looking at it is, I think, I completely agree. I think in 99% of the situations, director pay is really a non-issue. It's a non-event. Most companies are, a large cap board. It's $250,000 to $300,000 a year that a board member is being compensated, and you look at the level of talent that's being attracted to do that, and if you want to work this out on a per hour basis, it works out to roughly about $1,000 per hour. And if you think about the skill set of that's being brought in, I think one can argue that that's a very reasonable compensation arrangement. But I think why ISS cares about this is what we've seen in the past year to 18 months is the rise of activist investors, and with their nominees that they're looking to put on the board. Not that any of these have passed, but you had with Elliott Management at Hess and with Jan at Agrium, where they wanted to have a special compensation arrangement for the board members that for their nominees. And what that could potentially create is a two-tiered system where we have one set of board members being compensated at one level and then another set of board members compensated very differently. And I'm all for pay for performance, and I think shareholders are all for pay for performance. But I think what the concern here would be is does this lead to a rise in short-termism in terms of the decisions that board members would make, the new nominees that would potentially drive short-term success in the stock price, but potentially lead to longer-term issues down the road. And many of the index investors, because they are long-term holders, they're not necessarily in agreement in how the decisions would potentially be made by these nominees. So I think that's where ISS does care about this. Like I said, at the end of the day, you need to ask them that, but I'm kind of thinking why would they care about that is really to make sure if some of these anomalies were to occur, to be in a position to be able to opine on that.
I just thought they ran out of things to sort of focus on, and we might as well focus on director compensation, because it just, in the long run, it just seems like there's so many other things. So
many other governance issues that I completely agree 100% of that.
Yeah. I saw recently in an article in the Wall Street Journal where the Equilar's research was quoted about incenting CEOs to sort of complete a CEO succession project, I'll call it. And when I read that, I was surprised that the people that sort of supported that, that was going to be a growing thing. To me, David, when I read that, it seemed awfully misguided in the sense that that is the responsibility of the board. And yes, the CEO has to participate in that process, or at least they should be participating in some way. Sometimes you have CEOs that you don't want, that aren't doing a good job, and it's certainly not, in the end, to me, it's the board's job to do that, and yes, they should solicit them help. All the equity that the CEO has, particularly when it's vested out, over time, should be enough of an incentive. But sort of, what was your feeling when you saw that, and were you surprised by the people that seemed to be supporting this?
Yeah, it's very very interesting topic to talk about, and this is when I think about CEO pay issues. Typically, when they arise, it's typically around when there's a poor succession planning process in place, and what I mean specifically around that is the moment that the board realizes they do not have an internal candidate and they need to go externally to bring somebody in, that's when the whole pay mechanism falls apart. And to go bring somebody from the outside versus an internal promotion, it's typically a 50% premium on what you had to bring in an external hire. And so what I mean by that, if let's say the CEO is making $10 million, to bring somebody in from the outside, it's a minimum 50% premium that you're bringing in, or on average, in certain situations, even a lot higher. What ends up happening is then once you bring the outsider in and all the internal candidates or all the internal management team sees that, that changes the dynamic on their pay. So it has that ripple effect going down. The flip side of it is if you're promoting somebody internally, you're actually getting a pay savings. You don't necessarily need to pay that CEO as much as you paid the prior CEO, because that internal promotion is a first-time CEO more often than not, and doesn't have as many years experience as a CEO of a public company. And that person is just, that raise he or she got is a pretty substantial increase from what they had before, but still below what you're paying the prior CEO. So that's where succession planning, clearly, you're right, absolutely the board's responsibility in this. And, are we going to see more situations like what we saw at Intel where there is a specific award tied to that? I'm sure a lot of boards are discussing that right now. Is that necessarily the right answer? I wouldn't necessarily think that I think that should be, recognized as being that's part of the CEO's responsibility to work in partnership with the board to make sure that they have the right bench below him or her. One example, I think, with regards to specific equity awards, we had touched on this at one of your events, is the Exxon strategy in terms of how they've granted their awards. And this is something you should bring back Dave Swinford back on the air and have him talk about it, since he's the the outside advisor to Exxon there. But they've essentially built in succession planning into their comp program. It's not a separate award that's tied specifically to succession plan, because the grants that the CEO and the executives are receiving have a 10-year vesting horizon, even after they retire. Well, if this is a significant portion, percentage of your net worth tied to that, you're going to want to make sure you're going to have the right person leading that organization for a minimum for the next 10 years, so that I don't see my equity, my portfolio cratering. So I think if you're seeing boards potentially looking at Exxon and see what they did there and figuring out ways, are there ways we can build that into our corporate comp program?
For years, the process hasn't changed on how it's supposed to happen. The fact that I have the utmost respect for Intel and what they do. I sort of hope this isn't a trend, because I don't want to take it out of the responsibility of the board. And again, there's so many cases that you can give where something happens to somebody early. How do you treat it then? If you have a situation like that, I just don't think in the long run it makes that much sense to me. But that's a great segue into the next. Anything else that you've seen in your research lately that our audience might be interested in?
Sure, yeah. We've been doing quite a bit of work around board composition and kind of makeup of boards and whatnot. And I want to highlight two studies that we did, which I thought were pretty interesting. One was looking at CFOs joining boards. And we had looked at the Fortune 500, and roughly about 20% of the Fortune 500 CFOs had joined boards. And what we had found was in situations where the CFO joined a board versus an external board, not the company's current board that they're involved with, versus companies where the CFO did not join a board, is that the companies where the CFO joined a board outperformed the ones where they did not. And why is that? Is it the chicken or the egg, right? Cause and effect. And maybe it's because the companies that have outperformed have a stronger succession planning program in place, where they've recognized that level below, let's try to find board opportunities for them. So I thought that was an interesting study that we'd pulled together. The other one we just did with Spencer Stewart and got picked up by the Harvard Business Review, was looking at board turnover and trying to see what is the optimal level of turnover of a board, and to see the board refreshment issue. And what we found was having a modest level of turnover, roughly adding one new board member per year, those boards outperformed ones where they had no turnover at all, or very staid board, versus ones that had a very high turnover situation. So by having a modest level of turnover, that actually bringing the refreshment of ideas and contacts and whatnot, that those companies outperform. So that was picked up by the Harvard Business Review back in April.
Well, that would be fascinating, and you have the ability to sort of look at all of those slice and dices of looking at, which would be fascinating, and see if there's anything in there that would be sort of revolutionary in the sense of guiding people to make good decisions. So
exactly.
Well, David, as usual, it's a pleasure to have you on. We'll look forward to having you back when we've got the next wave of research to sort of talk about. Thanks for joining us.
Great.
And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. Be back again next week with a critical topic to help you be a better board member or committee member. We'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.